Hello and welcome to episode 3 of the PowerScore LSAT podcast. This is John Denning coming at you from Los Angeles, California once again.
And this is Dave Killorn. I am, as usual, in Napa Valley.
You lucky man. How is it up there?
Rainy.
Not so lucky, man. Well, since you're stuck inside, I suspect you've got a cocktail.
I do actually have a cocktail, and here's the proof of it. Yeah.
Nicely done.
Especially because last week I had a rum and Coke, which is one of the classic drinks of all time. And since this is an extension of that episode in some respects, I have gone to Captain and Coke. So I feel like it's a good 1-2 punch here. And often if I'm out, I will drink either of these interchangeably. So I'm pretty satisfied. What about you?
There you go. I've tuned it down a little bit this week after some scotch and just literally straight vodka. Cheers to you, Freddie Mercury. Last time, I'm just drinking a beer, so I won't slosh around to prove it, but take my word. But in honor of the song that you and I have both, I think, agreed to for tonight, I've chosen an English beer. It's a Boddington's, it's a bitters. So if you guys hear me puckered up a few times, it's because I've had a sip.
It's not that bitter, though. I love that beer. It's great.
Yeah, I'm really a Scotch guy, so this is a true tribute.
Yes.
Tell me who we're in tribute to.
Well, we are tonight continuing the classic thematic idea that we started last time. And so when we had Queen last week and the question was about retaking the LSAT and whether or not you should retake the LSAT, this week we're talking about how to study for a retake. And so we have gone with Led Zeppelin, maybe the all-time classic rock and roll band. And the song choice here, I think, is particularly inspired with the retake idea. And the song is How Many More Times, which is the closing song on the very first Led Zeppelin album, one of my favorite Led Zeppelin songs. So,
same.
Hopefully,
I don't know
the
that
answer
we necessarily saw the applicability of the fact that it was the final song on the album.
Well, you beat me with that transition because I was going to say, hopefully, the answer is one more time is how many more times. So, you just stepped all over my transitional line there.
Apologies. What just occurred to me, this flash of insight. I don't get many, so I had to let loose.
No fate but what you make, man. You gotta make your own mark here.
But for anybody looking to rock out at the start of this thing, we'll put a link to that song. You can go listen to it, and many times I encourage. But as we transition out of that, let's do a little bit more house cleaning here and talk also at the outset about what's been going on in the LSAT world recently. Some of this, guys, will be old news if you've been listening, but I'm going to expand on one point that we have touched on, and that's the most immediate thing in the LSAT world, which is that this Friday, the 15th of February, the scores from the January test are coming out. I know we've mentioned this a few times. We're excited. I'm sure everybody shares our enthusiasm. But I think, as I mentioned last time, too, worst case, at least you've got a long, hopefully 3-day weekend here in the States to get your mind right. Here's the way that the score release is going to go, and this will be the first time we've actually explored the process a little bit. I'm going to be brief, but there are a few things you need to understand if you're sitting there anxious for your score on the 15th. First things first, a lot of people talk about going gray. The icons in their LSAT account turn colors. The way that used to happen was a few minutes before the release began. But the way it's been happening, and likely will again, is that they go gray right around midnight on release morning. So Thursday night, 11:59, Friday morning, 12 o'clock Eastern, that's often when the icons will change. Don't panic. That doesn't mean scores are coming. Scores are almost certainly going to come out Friday morning at 9 a.m.-ish, a little before, a little after Eastern. And when I say scores come out, what I really mean is that's when the release begins. Scores roll out over several hours, sometimes as many as 10, 12. Dave, I know we've seen as much as 14 hours from the start to the final.
With a regular release, that's what it is. There have been issues in the past. LSAC made a mistake relatively recently, and unfortunately, some people were waiting, 70 plus hours for their scores? It was ridiculous.
Yeah, there was one where like a Friday or Saturday release went all the way into Monday or Monday afternoon, which is just torture. I don't anticipate that happening, in large part because I think they've smoothed this out a bit. And also January is a smaller test than the big September and November. But they will come out over several hours. So if scores come out at 9:05 and you don't see you're in the first wave, as we call them, don't panic. It's a random release and it comes in batches. They are not released based on score, based on name, percentile, based on anything. If you don't get it in the first couple hours, it doesn't mean there's a mistake or that there's some error. You can't panic and call LSAC. Just be patient. I know that's easier said than done. The good news is you will almost certainly have your score at some point on Friday. The other good news with that, I know, it's as specific as I can be. The other good news is that if you get your score back and find yourself in the position where tonight's topic is particularly relevant, you've got about 5 days before you need to make a decision to sign up for the March 30th, the next LSAT. The deadline for that is February 20th, so take a couple days. Let the score that you get on Friday, if you get one, marinate. Think about what we talk about here tonight as well, and in episode 2. And then you can make that decision probably on the 18th or 19th is a good idea, just in case there's any hang-ups and something goes wrong, you need more time. But that's the next couple of days in the LSAT world. But we also want to take a quick moment and look back. And I'll let Dave, sorry, buddy, I know I left you with little. I'll let Dave take that.
You've left me with very little in terms of the remainder of the week or what happened previously.
Yeah. Selfish.
And just as a regular thing, we're always going to update what they're doing. You know, part of our job, the way I see it, is to keep a very, very, very close eye on LSAC and to see what they are doing. So one of the things I think some people may not be aware of is that in the last several months, they've started their own blog. It's called Lawfully, which sounds kind of cool. And then you realize that they put law:fully. So I'm like, okay, I get your point. Like, you're full of law. I don't love it, but whatever. It wasn't my choice. So they have been recently putting out first generation law student stories. And I think they're actually really interesting to read.
Cool.
I love seeing people like make that journey and kind of like transform their lives in a really positive way and then, transform other people's lives. So they posted that, a little bit less than a week ago. And they've also been doing really kind of like these online webinars where you have Kelly Testy, who is the CEO, president of LSAC, and she's joined by a guy named Ken, who is the CEO of a different corporation that they're linked up with somehow.
Just Ken.
Just Ken. I can't remember his last name. Sorry, Ken. If you're listening, Ken, bro, I'm deeply apologetic for my oversight. I'll correct it. Probably never. Anyway, they do a thing called Live with Kelly and Ken, and they usually pull in several law school deans. I watched the first one, and the technical difficulties were rather severe. So I think they've gotten it a little bit more organized. And you can see that what they're doing here with this blog and with these webinars is they're trying to do more outreach. They're trying to put a public face on what they do. And I think that's a great thing. I just wish that it wasn't so broadly based. For our purposes, I don't care about a lot of the other things they do besides the LSAT and then CAS and making sure that applications are running very smoothly. So when you have stories about first-generation law students, that's good. The Kelly and Ken seminar was about the financial landscape of legal education, which is great, but they talk about things in a really broad way. But if those topics interest you, it's worth checking out. We probably won't say a whole lot about them going forward because the topics just don't really impact what we're talking about. And that is obviously going to be more and more specific about the LSAT and things of that nature. So anyway, that's what the week's been like in the LSAT world and kind of what's coming up. It's actually an exciting time when you have score release. For sure. But as John mentioned, that may bring up the topic of whether or not you need to retake the test. And last week, we talked about that question, is a retake for you? And if you're still thinking about that, go back and listen to that episode and see what we talked about and the various factors that are worth considering. Tonight, what we want to do is to switch that focus and assume at this point that you are taking it again and really get into the idea of what do you need to do to prepare to be able to improve your score. And as kind of a framework for this, we're going to quasi-base this on an article I wrote a while back called Retaking the LSAT, What to Do Differently to Raise Your Score. We'll link that for you in the podcast description. And that is a portion of what we're going to talk about. We're going to talk about a lot of the elements. We're not going to talk about it even in the same order, but this podcast and that article will really work well together. So let's go ahead and get started with that because that's really what I think I'm most excited about talking about tonight. Definitely not, the new LSAC blog or anything like that.
So, not Ken. All right.
Yeah, let's open that up. Let's get over the line and start talking about, you've decided that you are going to retake the LSAT. You're thinking to yourself, all right, you've chosen your test. Where do we go from there? John, you want to start with that?
Yeah, so many of the things that we talk about here are necessarily prefaced, almost caged in the idea of having the right mentality. It's just impossible to succeed on this test, or at least to reach your full potential on this test, if your mind's not in the right place at the very beginning. And so that's where we're going to begin, is talking a little bit about the mindset that anyone who's planning to take this test again needs to first establish to make this process of restudying and retaking as successful as possible. And the first thing you really need to do should come as no surprise. You need to steel yourself to prepare to dive back in. I know it's been a bit of an arduous journey if you've been studying hard and find yourself not quite finished, but you're not quite finished, and you need to come to terms with that. You need to clear your schedule. You need to get ready to kind of get back in the saddle. So tell your family, tell your friends, look at your social life and start to think of ways maybe that you can pare it down to allow yourself to commit to this, hopefully, as Dave says, one more time. And the fact is, if you want a different outcome here, guys, you're going to have to do something different. And we're going to focus on those differences, but the first place to start is, again, making sure that your head's in the right place. So as we continue to do that, one of the things that Dave wants to talk about is, well, how do you get over the fact that you haven't been as successful as possible yet?
You just have to get over it. Again, this goes back to that beautiful fact of today's world, LSAT world at least, which is only our high score matters. Yeah. So if you've had prior failure, honestly, you have to simply step up and be like, okay, it doesn't matter. You can wipe the slate clean very quickly. And forgetting past failure is, of course, easier said than done. Every experience that you have leaves an impression. Earlier today, I saw something on a school board website, and they were like, children are like wet cement. Everything leaves an impression. And kind of like the LSAT and the experiences that you have taking tests live is very much the same way. Something goes well, it's a good impression. Something goes poorly, it can be a really bad impression. But the key is not to get tied to those ideas. And again, we don't want to go deeply into test mentality. We want to actually get into the mechanics of how to prepare for a repeat.
Sure. Although I will make one more comment on this, partly the selective amnesia that you encourage, which I think is good. But if you are going to remember certain things, it's not only the fact that I think you need to really embrace your past successes and make sure you bring those along with you and that they bolster you and prop you up. You should also keep in mind that most of the work has hopefully been done already. You don't start at zero when you come back into this thing. You've started the journey, you've climbed part of the mountain, you haven't reached the summit, but you're not at base camp again all of a sudden. You may not have to go back and relearn a lot of the things that you have already got established. So you want to start fresh, but that doesn't mean starting as a completely blank slate. All the things you've done to this point that went well, were successful, they stay with you.
Yeah, you have a platform to launch from.
That's right.
And so if you take that idea, and really the key idea here is to pull in the good with you. Michael Jordan, if he was just about to take the game-winning shot, is he thinking to himself, gosh, I've missed this shot so many times before? No, that's not what he's thinking. Beforehand, he was like, man, I'm always making these shots. I'm the best ever. And so it's the same kind of thing here. You pull all the good stuff, all the preparation that you've done. You don't forget that. You may want to change what you're doing, and that's really what we're going to talk about tonight for the most part. But you still remember all the learning that you've done, any positive experiences that you've had, questions you've seen, and so forth. But this is about mindset. You have to be focused. You have to be ready. Right. And I know John and I are rock solid in our agreement on how important this actually is.
Absolutely.
So now let's just say that you make that decision and you then all of a sudden start thinking to yourself, boy, I don't know if I can dive back into this pool, or I'm not ready for it, or I hate the LSAT and I'm sick of it, or I hate law school applications, or all these kinds of things. That's really kind of like a related point here is if your mindset is telling you that you're not prepared, then you need to stop and recharge. I've written articles about how taking breaks from the LSAT, especially long breaks, like 3, 4, 5, 6 months, actually has a really positive effect on your understanding of the test. And often, students who take a significant amount of time off come back and are suddenly better. Now, that's not to say you should study for 2 weeks, then take 4 months off. and then come back and be like, where's my, my 6-point score increase? That's not what I'm talking about. What I'm talking about is going out there and studying hard for several months. And then, if you do take time off, oftentimes those students who have really built a giant base and have a lot of experience, when they come back, they discover, gosh, I'm seeing this a little bit more clearly. I'm a little bit faster. And that's because this is a process test, not a fact-based test.
Right.
If you take time off from a fact-based test, you lose those facts. You forget them because you're not using them every day. With processes, your mind doesn't forget them. Once it's done that process enough, it stores it away. And then when you take a couple of months off, your subconscious begins working on those ideas, and it kind of builds what I like to think of as like an idea pyramid, where it structures everything together so that when you come back, you know where things are. Your mind accesses them more quickly, and you're better at what you're doing. So if you're sitting there and you're thinking to yourself, I've taken a lot of time off, that should not be a cause for concern. And if you're thinking I'm burned out and I need time off, that's okay. You can go ahead. You won't forget everything that you've actually learned.
Right. However, I'll put a little asterisk on this. I know a lot of people, and it's funny to be talking about this specifically this week, where this is a make or break Friday for a lot of people. A lot of people aren't going to have 6 months off. They're looking down the barrel of probably their last chance in March if they want to apply. So for those of you thinking like, well, I can't take 4, 5, 6 months off, that's okay. Even a couple of days to just reset yourself is often extremely valuable. And again, the idea of bringing a lot of these things with you, I analogize this at times to, how long would it take you if you were fairly fluent in a language to not speak that language and then try to speak it again and not be able to? Or for those of you who drive with some regularity, how long would you have to stop driving before the next time you got back in a car, you were a terrible driver? I'm not saying that these skills stay with you forever, but I bet it'd be quite a while before you found yourself really out of sorts, discombobulated, or influent in the terms of the language analogy. And the reason why, again, is this is muscle memory. These are skill-based types of abilities, not short-term memory, fact-based things. So even if the time that you take off, let's say you haven't studied since you took the test in November, in January, and now you're looking at it, you're like, you know what? I listened to episode 2. They make a good point. I'm going to take it again in March. But I haven't done anything in a few months. Don't freak out. You're okay. Those skills are still there. They may require a little bit of polish, some dusting off, but they'll come back to you quite quickly. And that actually, to me, then leads into a big part of this discussion, which is, so once you've committed, once you've got your mind right, once you realize like, all right, there's enough success here that I'm not starting from the bottom, what do I do then to get the wheels turning again and keep going?
Yeah. And that's really the key thing, because everything else has been mental up until this point. And here you get into the physical realm. It's the last stage of things. But the first thing is to do is take an inventory of all the materials that you have, whether those are course books, whether those courses you've taken, whether it's LSATs. Determine exactly what it is that you have in front of you. And start to think about, is this enough material for me to have for a retake? And do I need to get anything else? So, for example, if you know for a fact that, all right, I didn't feel comfortable in the last logic game section and you felt like you could have studied more, get more games. Get something like the Logic Games Bible. Avail yourself of resources that are out there. Organize all those materials so you know exactly what it is that you actually have. Look at your schedule as well. One of the key things is that you can't cram for this test. You have to study on a regular basis. And in order to be able to do that, you have to make sure you understand your schedule. If you're working and all of a sudden you're about to do some travel, you've got to build in study time either before and after that travel or during it. You just have to be aware of exactly where your time is going. And you also want to have a life. You can cut down on your social life a little bit, but I am a firm believer that if you don't have balance in your life, it makes it really difficult to enjoy what you're doing. Yeah. So
that LSAT hermit look is dangerous, frankly.
Yeah, it really is. And it's not good for really all sorts of different things. So from an LSAT perspective, one of the questions that we often get is, how many should I do?
Yeah.
Not only how many tests should I complete or study through, but how many should I actually take in a timed fashion? And most people who see me answer questions in places like our forum or online, what have you, will know that I often will say it depends upon the person and I need to know a lot more about your schedule. So instead of saying that, which is a smooth cop-out on my part in this particular environment, I'll instead kick it over to John and make you know.
Oh, that's great.
I'll make you do it.
I will take this, in fact. There's a couple things to keep in mind with this. I mean, Dave makes a good point about schedule. I'll make a secondary point about there's not so much a precise number, not even necessarily a minimum. Instead, what I want to talk about is simply doing as many as you can, provided, and this is something that unfortunately doesn't get prioritized enough, provided that you also have enough time to review those tests in full. That to me is as beneficial, if not more so, than the act of taking the test itself. You can take all the tests in the world, but if you don't understand what's actually happened on them and to you during them, you really haven't gained much benefit.
Yeah, useless.
Right. So make that your gauge, your barometer of sorts is, look, I can build in this many, and that also allows me time for review. And oftentimes those reviews take as long as the test itself, frankly.
A good review is going to take at least as long.
And we're going to talk about how to review a little deeper into this. So I think that'll be helpful as well. You can get a better sense of what we mean by like deconstructive or post-test self-analysis. That's all coming. But know that one test probably equals about 2 tests worth of time.
Yeah.
So think about that with your schedule.
But the key is quality over quantity.
Perfect.
I would rather have somebody take 2 tests and review them really thoroughly and get everything they can, or at least a lot of what they can out of them, as opposed to take 3 or 4 tests and not review them that well. Mm-hmm. And of course, one of the things that a lot of students like to do is, I got that question right, so I'm just going to move on from it. And, you know, this is an idea that really bothers me, because ultimately what you're saying is, I couldn't have done any better on that question. I got it right. I'm good to go. But what if you could have done better? What if you could have sliced 5 more seconds off that question? Or what if you could have seen it more quickly and been more confident about it? These are the types of things that you want to look at when you're actually reviewing. Another question that often comes up is people will say, well, I've got prep test 60 to the present. Is that enough? Again, I don't know. It might be. I would love to see you do more. I'm a big fan of telling people, if you're not done until you've done them all. However, I also realize that that can be a ridiculous, hope in a modern world where everybody's
Half the people listening to this just fainted.
This guy's crazy, man.
I flinched. Yeah.
You shouldn't have flinched, though. You know that I'm right about this. The key thing is, though, is how many tests do you need to do to get the score that you want? Since I know how important the LSAT is in getting financial aid for law school, I always think to myself, well, is the extra couple of hours studying this LSAT worth it? Probably in the long run, it definitely is. Yeah. But when you try to balance doing as many as possible, hopefully all of them, with the idea of doing them in a qualitative fashion, you can see you have a problem, because you could spend years doing this to some extent. And some students are out there working it like a job. I know students who study at 40 hours a week, and they almost will do 8 to 5 Monday through Friday. And I always think to myself, it's great to have like a financial situation or parents like that, set you up to be able to do that. Obviously, tons of people don't have that, and I don't think it's the norm to be able to do that.
Nor is it the necessary component to success here.
Exactly.
I see plenty of people burn themselves out because they have the luxury of too much time, frankly.
Yeah. That's where you need to take breaks when you're kind of going through it.
Yeah.
It's really more of a sufficient idea, because if you start doing all the tests and you really review them well, it becomes this thing that's really, I'm not going to say is entirely sufficient, but it is a big piece of the sufficiency to getting that high score that you're looking for.
Right.
So doing some tests is necessary. Is doing all of them necessary? No.
So you mentioned test 60 to 85 now, I suppose. It's the latest as of this
86.
recording. It's releasing. Yeah. 86. What about older tests? I'm sure there are people listening to this and they're like, yeah, great. I'd love to have some fresh new tests too. I'm in this limbo period, at least until late June, where I don't have anything new or anything recent. What do you feel about tests, say, pre-60, pre-50?
Well, I think probably today the common thing is 50 to the present, everybody feels pretty comfortable doing. And there was kind of a rumor that went around several years ago about like, oh, you don't need to do the test before 50. And I remember hearing that thinking, Those who forget the past are doomed to repeat it, or in this case, doomed to be tricked by the questions that repeat those ideas. And so for me, I'm a big fan of older tests. Are they exactly the same? No, there are differences that we see in terms of how they've been made at times, in terms of the way some of the ideas are presented. But one of the things that always kind of makes me happy is when somebody's gone back to an old test and they start asking questions about it. And when they come back to, say, our forum, or, they're sending us a message, they're like, I realize now that this idea relates to something I saw, on the September test. And I'm like, yes, these ideas get circulated and recirculated constantly. So there's really very little that is new under the logical sun. And so in the LSAT world, you can go back and see the pattern of history and understand, oh, they did this here, then they did it there, then they did it a third time this way. They're always trying to make little changes and alterations. But one of the big advantages in doing as many LSATs as possible is that you get as many looks as you can at the different way that they present ideas. Secondarily, they bring ideas back.
Sure.
Take a look at last year in the July test, and you had that circular game. There hadn't been one since 2003. Everybody was like, yeah, I don't have to worry about the circularity thing. And here we are 15 years later. Hey, guys, this is LSAC. How'd you like a nice circular game? Have a great day. And it destroyed a lot of summers, I would say, last year with that.
Yeah, it did. Pattern games ditto. We've seen 3 of those in 2014, 15, and 16, but they were more than a decade absent. If you had looked at some of these older tests, you'd have been in a much better position to see this, what was then novelty, reemerge. So I always kind of talk about it as this almost superficial, this illusion of novelty. But it's really the same thing. It's a single well. They're just good at disguising the same bucket that they're pulling things up with. It's nothing under the LSAT sun changes, as you say.
Yeah. And, they know what they're doing, too. They understand the psychological game that they're playing.
Sure.
They can take an idea and drain it out of the LSAT for 3, 4, 5 years, knowing that some people out there will be like, I don't have to worry about that anymore, which, of course, is the perfect time for them to, rub their hands greedily and be like, here you guys go. So that's just life. I mean, it's a psychological battle. It's the same thing if you see 5 C's in a row. You're like, oh, man, I made a mistake. But they do that kind of thing.
Yeah.
So especially 4 happens all the time. Anyway, the point being that you want to try to balance your schedule. You also want to make sure that you have a very organized schedule. Know what it is that you need to work on. Set it up so you have enough time every week. Get new materials if you don't have them. If you only have 20 LSATs, get another 10 LSATs. It will not hurt you, and the value of it can be really kind of immense. So, and there's almost always more information to pull out of questions, which is something that we'll actually talk about a little bit later.
Definitely. You talk, though, about new materials. I don't want to cut you off if you've got another point to make, but I do know that we want to touch on I don't want to call it worst case scenario because it's actually not that bad, but I know for a lot of people it feels a little bit defeatist. What if you have nothing else to look at that's new? What if you've seen everything? You've done every test that you can get.
And you've done it well? How well have you done it?
That becomes then the next question. Yeah.
We'll talk a little bit about the way to kind of prove whether or not you have learned a question 100% near the end of this podcast. But what I always tell people is if you think you've gotten everything out of a question, the chances are that you haven't. And that's just because these questions are so well made. There's often more information inside of them. Every LSAT instructor that I've ever worked with, and that spans, hundreds, if not, I guess probably thousands of people at this particular point, they've never been the type of person who immediately reads a question one time, gets every bit of information about it, I mean everything, and then never has to look at it again. And instead what happens is they go in to teach a class, somebody asks an interesting question, and they're like, oh, I didn't realize they were doing that. Now, part of that is something that happens a lot in the wrong answers. And it's something a point I like to make, which is 20% of what you see on the LSAT is right. That means that 80% of it's wrong. You're usually looking at stuff that's incorrect. And you could say that, that's the garbage part of the test, but that's really what their attraction points are, where they're trying to get you to pick things. And I love to look at wrong answers and say, what were they going for here?
Right.
Who was going to choose this? Why did they think that someone would actually be attracted to this? Sometimes it's obvious. Sometimes I look at questions and I'm like, that's dangerous. I can see where people are going to go down there. Every once in a while, I'll be in a class or someone will ask me a question. I'll be like, oh, I never would have seen it that way. Is that how you saw that? Oh, and then I realized that a lot of people have interpreted it in that way, and they just were able to come at a path or an avenue that I hadn't anticipated. That happens to every instructor, and it's something that we've all had an experience with. So if that's happening to us, people who are professionals at this, imagine how easy it is for someone to say, I did that question, I got it right, I know everything I need to know. Chances are that there is still more out there that you should know. So the point I was actually make, John, is it's okay. It relates back to the idea of if you're making your study schedule and you're struggling with it, keep in mind that on our self-study site, we have a variety of self-study schedules that are free and available to anybody.
Yes.
And I do want to make one comment about these because occasionally I see comments on online forums and so forth, and it relates to the idea of how closely do you have to stick to them. Keep in mind that those are built in kind of a broad-based fashion. They don't know what your schedule is. They don't know what your strengths and weaknesses are. What they're saying is these are the kinds of topics that you should cover in this type of order, and this is a reasonable workload for you to go through. But if you're thinking, I'm great at reading comp, I crush that all the time, well then remove the reading comp portions and do a lot less of them. And if you need more logic games, focus more on that. If you have time to do extra tests, do more tests. You're not limited by it. Use it as what it is, a framework to help you understand how to prepare and how to study, not as a holy grail that can never be altered or questioned. So
that's right. Yeah, it's a template of sorts, suggestions. To me, I see it almost more of a timeline as opposed to like you must do this at this point, you must do this at that point. It's very malleable in that sense. Yeah. But they do at least give you some structure to operate within, which is the big part of a schedule itself.
Yeah. And that's the key thing. And if you think about, you've got your mindset, now you've got your schedule, you got your materials. The next question that we can move on to is now you're ready to go. You've got everything in place. This is where the rubber hits the road. And the first thing that you're going to run into is, well, what do I study? Do I just start taking tests? Do I start reading various books? Do I take a course? Different ways to go, but the first thing I always like to say is find out what you're really good at and that you're kind of like bulletproof at, and find out what you're kind of in the middle on and what you're really bad at. It's easily said, find your strengths and weaknesses, but nothing is just binary black and white. It is a range. I'm pretty good at this. I'm great at that. I'm not so good at that. I'm terrible at this. And so in the article that we've linked about retaking the LSAT, we actually, in step 4 in that article, give a series of tests that anybody can use to kind of analyze various questions and to break down what they are good at and what they are not that great at. And I mention that right up front here because I think it's important to realize you're not on an island. Sometimes people are like, well, I don't know how to analyze myself. There are tools out there. If you are willing to do some research and willing to look into it, you can make sure that you have the ability to actually self-analyze. I think it's probably the hardest thing to do in terms of LSAT preparation, aside from like learning something completely new. But it's one of the most important things for you to do. And this entire step is about figuring out where you are strong and where you are weak at. So
the tests in that article are so good. They're for each section. There's multiple parts to each test. And again, that's the Retaking the LSAT article that we'll link here in the description. But if you're looking for a better analytic tool, man, those really give you some concrete ways to do it.
Yeah. I mean, think about like the reading comprehension tools that are actually in there. They focus on how well you remembered what you read, how well you can predict what it is that is going to be asked of you after reading a passage, and even how well you understood the framework of the passage overall.
The view stamp, right.
Yeah. And so there are different ways to test that. And it's not just go do a passage and then the questions. We actually isolate tools to be able to say, okay, what we want you to do is to read the passage, now put it away, write a description of it. Now predict what questions you're going to get. Now let's see what questions you do get. All right, how close or how far off were you? And doing that any individual single time isn't necessarily going to prove anything. But if you do it 4, 5, 6 times, you'll start to see patterns, especially in those areas where you're really weak at. You'll discover I'm completely off base with all of this. And then you know that you have to sit down and actually study that, which kind of brings up a secondary supplementary point with this is analyzing what you were doing is really helpful. It's only half the battle. You have to track it. You've got to be able to log all this stuff because in 2 or 3 weeks, you will have kind of forgotten what it is that you weren't so great at. And so one of the things that we always tell students is keep a very detailed log of all the questions that give you trouble. And notice carefully, I didn't say all the questions you miss. That's not what I'm talking about. I said all the problems that give you trouble. If you do a problem and you think it's easy and it's clear and you felt like you really understood it, it doesn't need to be logged. All right, you got that idea. But let's say you do a question that takes you 2.5 minutes. You're like, I kind of struggled with that. I wasn't totally sure. Oh, but I got it right. I had it down to A and B and it was A. I got it right. Should that be on the list?
Absolutely. Yeah.
Without question. So it's that kind of tracking. And a lot of times when I ask students, what are you not good at? They'll say logic games. And I'm like, all right,
Go on.
a common answer, to be honest with you. And then what John just said, go on, let's continue. You know, it's like therapy, something where somebody's like, I have anger issues. Well, anger at what? Everything, the entire world? You're just angry every minute? Or is it something that your partner did and continues to do? You have to isolate these problems in order to figure them out.
Yeah, and be specific.
Exactly.
Yeah, that's one of the things that I think people do on this test, unfortunately, is they just generalize their mistakes. I suck at the LSAT. Well, that gives me nothing to help you with. That gives you nothing to help yourself with. You need to really dial this down as molecular as possible. And again, the tracking log will help with that. Guys, the self-study site that we referenced and the study plans there, they have built-in trackers, performance trackers in each of those plans. If you want some ready-made ones, go there. It's already gridded out and mapped for you. All you got to do is fill in your details and be, again, specific.
Exactly.
So as we look at this stuff, that's going to be a key is how do you know what to fix? Well, you only are as good as your ability to drill it down and say, this is a problem. Not grouping games, but this idea within grouping games.
This
not,
rule.
Yeah, not games where the variable sets don't match, but games specifically where you have uncertain numerical distributions or multiple These are the degrees of specificity that we're talking about.
Yeah, in something like logical reasoning, you see someone, they'll say, oh, I got it down to A and B, and then I chose the wrong one. And I often am like, well, tell me what attracted you to the wrong answer and what didn't attract you as much to the right answer. Be specific about it so I can understand your thought process. And you may think to yourself, well, you know, understanding my thought process on one question isn't the biggest deal. It's never about one question. It's about creating literally a library of how you take this test and then being able to go back and see what you've done. Because in a lot of cases, I can look at someone's, performance tracker and later on figure out, oh, well, the fundamental cause is this. You don't actually understand how this idea works. And because of that, it's causing you to miss problems that are over here in method. It's causing you to miss these must be true questions. And so we can go back to the root diagnosis, figure that out, and then fix what appears to be a completely unrelated set of problems relatively quickly.
Yeah. It also takes the unreliability of just human recall out of the equation. I talk to friends who gamble all the time. I'm like, man, that team always cost me money. I'm like, I bet if you actually look back and see how you did, it's probably about 50-50. Oh, the dealer always, gets 21. Probably not. But these are the things that stand out as you start to think back at your experiences, good and bad. But with the actual tracker, you could say, like, oh, no, the dealer got 21 1 out of 18 times or whatever it was.
No,
it just felt bad because whatever it is.
That.
It just felt bad because that's when you had a lot of money on the table or whatever. So
every
the tracker
time I have
really
a lot of
makes
money
it
on
concrete.
the table, that's when they get 21.
Yeah, me too. But that's really the idea behind this stuff. It not only allows you to be specific, allows you to see patterns and trends in the bigger picture, but it keeps you honest. It keeps you data-driven, which is what we want.
Yeah, and if you think about it, the LSAT, you think about it as like, oh, these three big sections, but that's not the way the test is actually made up. It's not just it's a logic games or it's logical reasoning.
Right.
It's all these different skill sets and pieces that you use the word molecular before. I'd say atomic, but it's the same type of idea. We could say granular, and show our synonym power here. But the idea is that it really gets down to this micro level. Now it's on you to come up with a fifth one, where you're looking at little individual things. And yes, there's a larger fluid connection between how you do a logical reasoning problem or how you attack reading comprehension. But when you're trying to figure out strengths and weaknesses, the bigger pieces are not actually where you want to focus on. Mm-hmm. The time you want to focus on the bigger pieces is when you're dealing with a limited amount of time to prepare. And let's say you have 3 weeks. I don't want to get into something that's really detailed and thorny to understand. Formal logic being a perfect example. I get a lot of questions about this because it's tough, it's confusing. I know that it's tough and confusing. If you haven't picked it up and it's 3 weeks from the test, probably time's better spent focusing on linear games or grouping games than it is on something like formal logic.
It's just doubly so because it's just vanishingly absent anyway.
Exactly. And those two ideas go hand in hand. The difficulty is one thing. The fact that it's not tested that much is equally important.
Yeah.
So
just as bad it must be true as cannot be true. What do I do? It's not a hard decision. The scales have tipped.
Yes, in this particular case, let's not worry about cannot be true.
Right.
Let's get into that must be true. So just think about that and look at that article that we've linked here and check that out because it gives you these various tests, and those tests are invaluable in terms of trying to determine where it is that you actually stand in terms of how good or bad you are at certain skills that are necessary to do well in this exam.
Yeah, and this is actually the first part of what I see is a bit of a cyclical or circular type of series of steps. Once you can identify strengths and weaknesses at this level to this degree of specificity, and again, find some help getting that analysis or whatever, that specificity, if you can't do it on your own. The next thing is, well, how do I start to really drill this stuff? How do I work on this and begin to not only maintain my strengths, but remove or improve my weaknesses? And this is where the practice comes in. So after identification really becomes, call it repair, fix, this is where you want to start to time yourself, either take sections, take full tests, even overdrive it, as we sometimes say. Take 5-6 section tests at times. But the idea here is that practice becomes essential once you know what it is that you should be focused on.
Yeah, I love the overdriving of tests, by the way.
Me too.
Especially if somebody comes and says to me, boy, after the break, my score always seems to go down. I'm like, well, you're probably tired.
Yep.
I mean, and honestly, you should be tired. It's a grueling test. Every time I've walked out of the LSAT, I've thought to myself, I want to die. And then I'm like, no, I'm going to go to a bar instead and just, destroy every brain cell I have just to get the thought of taking the test out. And literally like the body fatigue. It's amazing that a mental test could just crush your body the way that the LSAT does, but it always feels like a full body experience.
Your hand hurts, your eyeballs hurt. Yeah, it's rough. Maybe I'm getting old.
You are getting old.
Thank you, buddy.
But if that practice is essential, and stamina is all a part of this, there's also that extra level of you do all these practice tests. The more that you do, the more that you see from them, the better you're going to understand where they go. And John just mentioned that cyclical idea where we get to these steps now. And I want to kind of follow up on that because it's not as if you just identify your strengths and weaknesses one time and then you go on and you work through them and you're done. You're going to come through here and take these practice tests. You're going to do the reviews that we're going to talk about, and then you go back and look at it again.
Yeah.
That's the cyclical idea where it's like, all right, I've worked on strengths and weaknesses. Now let me go and actually check it again. Now let me work on those.
Yeah, it's not static. It's very organic. They evolve, or they should, as you continue to work on things. Somebody who comes in terrible at games may have that as their bedrock come test day, or even very quickly after they start. So this to me is the idea of why you have to continue to circle back.
Yeah, and you need to take a lot of practice tests, especially as you are later in your preparation. I don't often worry about a whole lot of practice tests early on because I want students to focus on, do I understand these ideas?
Right.
Going fast in your first week of LSAT preparation isn't useful. Going fast in your last week of LSAT preparation, very useful.
Pretty necessary.
So everything's got its particular time. Which brings us to, I think, kind of something that everybody encounters to some extent and can really throw people off, and that is score variation in your practice tests. You're taking practice tests to learn about the test, to see how you do, to build up stamina, all these positive things. But there is a big negative, and that is if you go out and you don't do well. And I think for many people, it's more outsized than it really should be. And that's because the response that they have to this is to freak out. So if you've been tracking along at 158 and you're slowly rising up and you get a 158, 159, you're flirting with that 160, and then you go out and you get a 153, for a lot of people, the immediate response is it's a catastrophe. Life's over. I can't believe what's happened. They're posting online, guys, what's going on? This is unbelievable. I was making such good progress. And my response to that is always the same. Slow down, chill out.
Relax.
Yeah, relax. Because the bottom line is that you just did it one time, and there's natural variation in this. We've talked about score bands before, these types of things. I'm not worried about that. Now, if you go do it 5 times in a row, I'm like, what's happening? But 1 or 2 reversals of fortunes or setbacks, that doesn't bother me. That's going to happen. We've talked about the LSAT casino a little bit. You don't know what kind of test you're going to get. You don't even know what kind of day you're having sometimes until it's almost over. And it could have been that you were extra stressed. Maybe you didn't drink your coffee that morning. There could be a million reasons why you might not have a great practice test. Don't outsize its importance.
Right.
Keep it as in perspective as for what it is, which is not my best performance, not going to worry about it. Let's keep on going. It's also, as a side note, one of the reasons that I am not a big fan of taking practice tests in the several days before any given LSAT, because I've seen too many people under the impending pressure of the test have a rough day and then go into full-on freak-out mode, which is not good for anybody's health. So just something to keep in mind. I think, John, the analogy you and I were talking about the other day was the swimmers analogy, where they train really hard until, I don't know if it's like 7 to 10 days before a meet, and then they taper down, which means they aren't training as hard. And that's kind of how I feel LSAT preparation really should be, is that you should taper down in that last 7 to 10 days so that when you coast into the test, you're actually feeling pretty good about it.
Yeah, especially if it means you can almost end on a high note. I'd much rather see somebody 5-6 days before the test crush a practice test and stop.
Yeah.
Than, continue to try to escalate up through the 48 hours prior.
Keep the echo of positivity that you're going to get from that.
It's end on a great note and take it with you. I do want to put another side note in this, which is we've been obviously focused a lot on full practice tests and that idea, but that may not be the best way for everyone to spend their time. For instance, if you identify your errors and you're like, dude, I never miss anything in games, is that really the best 35 minutes I could spend? No, a lot of this identification allows you to start to drill down and isolate where exactly your time can be best spent, the most bang for your buck. It may not be full tests. It may not even be full sections. Maybe there's just a couple of game types or a couple of logical reasoning ideas that tend to give you trouble. For instance, we know that logical reasoning sections tend to be comprised of questions that get roughly harder as you go. If the only questions you ever miss, say 2, 3, 4 questions a section, are in 14 to 25, the first half of logical reasoning sections might not even be worth your time. I don't want you to get this to tweezer a level where you begin to pick things apart that way and scalpel it up.
You just gave everybody a hall pass.
This is not an ability to take half the day off. But it may be an ability to, instead of spending 2 hours on a practice test, to spend 2 hours even more concentrated, even more focused. For me, if I was going to do a test, I probably don't need to worry about a lot of it. That's not braggy. It just means that my time's really not well spent in the first 10 questions in logical reasoning, or the first easiest game in logic games. Dave, I can't see you, but I suspect you're probably rolling your eyes or making an astonished face.
I was just wondering if this is one of your 3 seconds of confusion that we talked about with like the virus game. Is this akin to that?
That was a low point. You want to keep bringing that up?
I'm going to bring that up probably for years and years.
Point being is that as you continue to work through this stuff, guys, realize where you're going to get the most reward for the time, for the investment of energy, especially if you've gone through a lot of this. You may have covered a lot of this ground already. I still love practice tests, partly for the stamina and endurance and just overall mentality it takes. But that may not be the best use of your time. It may not be necessary.
No, and keep in mind, too, if you don't have the time for a full practice test, it's okay to do one section
You're
or
not out of
two
luck.
sections.
Right.
Yeah, I see this especially with people who have a lot of work hours to deal with. They'll be like, I only can do one section at lunch. Is that a good use of my time? I'm like, completely.
Absolutely.
Yeah, go ahead and do it. Just because it's only one section doesn't mean that there's no value in it. It's incredibly valuable. You're putting yourself in a game time, game-like environment and seeing how things work out. Love it.
Yeah, speaking of a game, I mean, even a single logic game is better than doing nothing.
Completely.
Provided, again, you give yourself a chance to review it and really understand what went right and wrong.
Speaking of review, let's talk about that, because I think, as easy as it is to say, go take tests or identify your strengths and weaknesses, the real fixes within all this come from how you review various questions that you've done. Mm-hmm. Now, to be honest, it's really helpful if you're working with a tutor or an instructor to have them go through a lot of the questions with you, because they can see the problems that you're having more quickly. As I've always said to students in classes I've taught, I'm like, usually within the first hour, I'll have a pretty good sense of like everybody's skills and where they're standing right now. And that often helps me understand like what their potentiality is. It's not definitive, but after you've done this for a long time, you can see strengths and weaknesses within people very quickly just by doing a few questions. Yeah. So let's assume for a moment that you're only working with a tutor every once in a while, or you're just self-studying and you're not working with a tutor at all. This is where review becomes a huge component of how well you will actually improve. Doing questions by itself is only marginally helpful. Doing questions and reviewing them properly is massively helpful. It's that simple when we come down to this. So I put together an article a while back called The Best Way to Review LSAT Practice Tests. And one of the things that's in there, we talk about different ways to do it. I didn't say there's just one way to do it. And that's because I don't believe there's just one way to do it. Mm-hmm. If you did it the same way every time, let's say you blind reviewed every test, it gets boring. And the last thing LSAT preparation should be, honestly, is boring. It can be so fun, and there's some cool ideas. You learn the weirdest facts from these questions. Why not try to squeeze enjoyment out of it? But the key thing is that you can choose what you like the best, and you can mix it up. Sometimes you want to do questions, and you want to know what the answer is right there. You don't want to wait to redo it. That's fine. You can satisfy your curiosity. If you're that hot to know the answer, go find it out. Not everything has to be one way. There is no shotgun solution here. It's not like this is the only way to review practice tests, and if you don't do it this way, you're screwing yourself over. That's not the case at all.
Right.
So as you get into questions, though, let's focus on the idea of how you can get as much information from them as possible. And the thing is you have to slow down. First off, we know that we're going to look at questions that we had problems with, not necessarily that we just missed, but problems that we had questions with. One of the, I think, mistakes that people make is that they don't get deeply enough into the question. They're like, oh, I see why B is right, and then they're done. That's not how I want this to be. I want it to be so that and I used to say this to classes too, I'd be like, I want you to understand this so well that if I walked up and pulled the question out from in front of you, you could still tell me almost everything that was there.
Right.
Like in logic games, that's how I feel about logic game setups. When you make a setup, I should be able to walk over, remove the game from you, and you should then be able to tell me everything about the game still.
Yeah, reconstruct the scenario, give me every rule.
Yeah. It may not be that you remember which color M stands for or G, or you may not remember if it was about craftsmen or craftspeople or whether it was about craft at all. It doesn't matter, but you would understand the structure of what you're actually looking at. In a similar sense, when you're reviewing questions properly, what you are doing is you're going back through those questions and you are breaking them down into very small pieces, each of which you understand. You read that stimulus and you look at it and you say to yourself, all right, in my own words, what does this actually say? You're paraphrasing it. If you are looking at something that didn't make sense, you're slowing way down. Oh, they used a double negative here. I read it a little too fast and I didn't really realize how important that was. Yeah. Or you miss a word like probably, which completely can change, the outcome of a problem here.
Yeah. Is there a conclusion? Did I spot it? I thought this was a conclusion, but it's just a fact set. Was there conditional reasoning and I didn't see it, or I diagrammed it wrong? Or was there causal reasoning that I missed or misunderstood? All of these questions become key as you analyze each part. And it's not just the stimulus.
Hey, you read the problem, and then all of a sudden you thought it was a good argument, and then they're asking you for the flaw in the
Or
reasoning.
to weaken it, yeah.
You're like, what? I didn't see any flaw. This is a great example where you need to slow it way down and be like, how did I miss
Figure this out. Yeah.
Which you should always be thinking about what the weakness is in any given argument anyway. I try to tend to approach LSAT questions a little bit like Sherlock Holmes looking for the scene of the crime. Like, I feel like a crime's probably been committed, so let me see where all the clues are. Oh, no crime was committed. It's a happy day. So that's kind of the breakdown that you're actually getting it. And the second thing is, as you try to break each piece apart and understand it, think about how that relates to how you solved it. Where did you go right? Where did you go wrong? This is how you get faster. To me, it's never about climbing the mountain. It's how fast you can climb the mountain. If I was a mountain climber, I would be the person who wanted to climb Everest in record time, because I would say, what's the most efficient way to do it? Which is a ridiculous way to climb Everest, I'm sure.
Dave, don't climb mountains. Mountain sprinter is not a good look for you.
I'm no Alex Honnold. Is that what you're saying?
Oh, God.
No one is.
No one is.
And by the way, if you're listening, you're like, who is Alex Honnold? He's the guy that free soloed El Capitan in Yosemite. And free soloing is when you climb a mountain face with no support, no ropes, nothing. The dude did it with his hands. He's immense. So anyway, that's I won't be doing any of that, John. So
yeah, stay on flat ground, buddy.
And keep in mind too that when you're going through these problems, we said before that getting it right isn't enough. If you got it right by accident, I don't care. It just doesn't count to me. I'm like, you better be able to tell me what the actual reason is. And then ultimately, as you sift all that information together, look for patterns and similarities. Mm-hmm. You have to be able to realize that the people who make this test will reuse concepts. Look for them. Look for the language reuse. Understand how this one's different and how it is the same.
Yeah.
They are creatures of habit, just like most people are, and they will repeat themselves over and over again. And it's really important when they don't repeat themselves and they change it up, and it gets a little bit different.
Yeah, I really liked what you said about the idea of looking at questions not just in terms of the analytical parts, but in terms of your reaction to them. Personalize this. It's as introspective as it is outward facing. I think a lot of people take this stuff apart in a very sterile sense. It's very clinical. Well, I saw this and I put that there and I did that thing. But if you can really see how it is that the test is basically psychologically influencing you, what it's making you feel, what it's making you do, answers that you lingered on for too long but ultimately dismissed. Why'd you linger? These are the questions that you ultimately have to discover and answer, and these are the things that lead to speed. It took me 8 seconds to get rid of A. Why did it take you more than 2? These
because
are the
they had
kinds
to
of
read
questions. You know what I mean.
They didn't just inhale it.
It took me 30 seconds to get rid of A. Why couldn't you have done it in 10?
Thank you. I think that's a little bit more realistic.
Point being is that you have to understand how the test is influencing you as much as you understand how the test itself is built and constructed and can be deconstructed.
And I think that's actually a useful sidebar too. You got to trust yourself. Your reactions are telling you what is happening inside the question. And we're moving a little bit away from like retaking the LSAT in this part of the discussion, but I'm comfortable with that. A lot of times people don't trust themselves. They read something, they have a bad reaction to it, and then they kind of talk themselves into it's okay. No, it's not. You didn't like it. You're not stupid. Your feelings actually are information.
Yeah.
Absorb them, use them to your advantage. I still remember, I'd have to go back and find this problem, but it was probably like the late 90s. And there was a weird phrasing. It said something to the effect that the computer never fails to accept the proper password. And I remember reading that and thinking, what? Why would you say that? Like, who talks that way? And of course, then it turned out that the possibility is that it was accepting wrong passwords or something similar. And I remember the correct answer revolved around the weird phrasing. And I thought to myself, man, that weird phrasing, if I had just let it go and not really focused on it and reacted to it, I would have missed this problem or at least spent a lot longer on it.
That spidey sense, right?
Spidey sense.
But
I like it.
That's what instincts are. Unfortunately, Dave, it cuts the other way too. And I know a lot of people out there listening to this probably find themselves victim of this, where they talk themselves out of right answers. They're like, I like this. Oh, but, and they'll sit in second and third guess and reread when your instincts should have told you, your training ultimately should have told you, if you've trained well, that was the correct answer and you can trust yourself. So what you're trying to do through this process is build your confidence on both sides. Your confidence to say, this doesn't feel right, this doesn't look right, and hopefully have a good reason for it. And at the same time, have confidence and say, you know what? I understand why this one appeals to me. I'm going to trust that instinct. That, again, you don't want to take a test like this from your gut. It's the old Carl Sagan line about, do you think there's extraterrestrials? And he said, well, I can't really comment. What does your gut tell you? Well, madam, I prefer not to think from my gut.
It doesn't. You can't. I don't know if I've heard that before.
Yeah, well, there you go. You can't run through this test on pure instinct, pure intuition, but when you're well trained, this is what they do. Tiger Woods doesn't have to analyze every component of his swing because he's trained to swing well. He gets up there and trusts the mechanics. That's where you want to reach. But this process of review is going to teach you how much you should trust or not, as I see it. And Dave, to tie this back in so it doesn't feel like quite a tangent, as maybe you felt it would be, I'm sure a lot of people are in the position to have to retake because of this particular symptomology.
Sure.
They went through a test and didn't do as well as they could have because they were changing right answers to wrong, falling for wrong answers despite an intuition or inner voice telling them not to.
Well, think about it this way. If you've chosen a wrong answer, you've chosen something that has a mistake in it.
Yeah.
And I'll just assume this is largely the case that LSAT's just right about every answer that's correct or incorrect. But if you had a right answer and then you changed away from it, it means that you still moved to an answer that had something wrong with it. Mm-hmm. This is always about problems. And just keep this in mind. If an answer is half wrong, it's all wrong.
Yeah.
And you can extend that out. If it's even a little bit wrong, it's entirely wrong. So if there's something you don't like and your gut's saying, I don't love that, yeah, maybe every once in a while you're going to miss a problem, but more often than not, your gut's going to actually be right about this. Carl Sagan be damned.
There he is. Well, he'd laugh at that. Put another way, you have to do two things wrong to miss a question, right?
Okay.
You have to not only miss the right answer, but then fall for a wrong one. It's going to take two missteps for you to land on the wrong place.
That's right.
If you can identify either of those, you're going to save yourself. So there's a lot of opportunity here.
You're right about being wrong there.
Thank you. I'm so confused.
So, no, it makes sense. Listen to it later.
Okay.
So we got to get through that idea of reviewing and making sure that you really understand this. I think that's kind of a helpful segue into the idea of how can you prove that you really understood what you have reviewed? How can you make sure that now that you have reviewed a question or a concept or whatever the idea might be, that you really do have mastery over it? And to me, there's a very simple way to actually do that. And it's something that in the article I call the teaching test. And that is to teach the question to someone else. Now, let's put aside the fact that that's sometimes a lot easier said than done. You have to find other people, and it's not as if your roommate or your mom or your sister is always going to be sitting there wanting to listen to LSAT question explanations given by you. But let's put that aside for a moment, because in the world of the online, there's always someone out there that will talk to you. So this teaching test is absolutely critical, and really what it is, it's what every LSAT instructor does every time they teach a class or prepare for a class. They are getting ready to go out and try to give the best possible explanation, hopefully. And how well the students understand it will tell really me as an instructor how well I'm actually explaining these ideas and how clear things are. And one of the things that it also does is that as you start talking, you very quickly have to organize your thoughts so that they are logically situated and are going to make sense. You have to be able to explain each part of any given problem, from the stimulus to the question stem to the answer choices, or maybe the rules or inferences, what have you. And that puts you in a position of quickly organizing information, making sure there's no holes in what you're actually talking about, and then being clear about enunciating the concepts. And usually, if you're incapable of any one of those steps, it's because you have a lack of knowledge in terms about what you're actually doing there. Mm-hmm. So that teaching test can be immensely helpful. And if you don't have many willing participants and subjects for you to test this out on, save the hardest questions. Save the ones that gave you the most trouble. Right. If you really are trying to figure out, and do I understand this? Because I'm still struggling with it a little bit. A, you probably don't if you have questions about it. But B, give it a shot at somebody and be like, hey, would you do this question? I want to then explain it to you and see how they actually react to that. Yeah. There is no better way to actually determine if you understand something than to do that.
It's the rule of thumb, right? If you can make someone else understand it, you're probably good.
Yeah.
So notice too how this, in a way, closes the loop, beautifully ties this all back together. We started with the notion of identifying where you struggle and keeping a very close track of it, data-driven performance log. From that, you know what to focus on as you continue to work through things. And that's where you start to take practice tests or practice sections or even individual ideas, question types and things. You do a deep and heavy review of those ideas to see what gave you trouble and how well you can identify and correct those things. And if you still aren't sure, find some hopefully willing participant that you can kind of experiment on and then learn from their reactions, not only whether they're understanding things, but what it was that drew them to wrong answers. They might have been attracted to an answer that never gave you pause, but their attraction is something that should teach you about the test makers and their aims. And then you're back into it over and over. But it's not as, I quoted this the other day, Matthew McConaughey's old True Detective Season 1, time's not a flat circle here. This spirals up and gets narrower and narrower and narrower. It's conical. That there should be fewer and fewer weaknesses to worry about. There should be greater and greater insight as you review. Hopefully fewer and fewer things that you need to work on as you keep going through it. But that's the way that I see all of this continuing to, again, help you climb the mountain.
Yeah, and that's exactly the way that it is. Repeat this over and over again. You get better and better. All right, we have come to the end of the discussion here. I want to say thanks to everybody for listening tonight. We really appreciate it. John, any final thoughts?
No, this is good. I suppose the last thought I'd give is if you are retaking, even after all of this, hopefully you can put this into practice. And above all, good luck, guys. Trust yourself, trust your training, work hard. You'll get through this. There's an end in sight, probably sooner than you think. But we really do wish you well. And if you need anything beyond this as you continue to study, please don't be a stranger.
Do not. And if you get a chance, subscribe to this podcast on iTunes or Spotify or YouTube. And we'd love to have you rate us as well. We'd like to get feedback and discover what you think. Hopefully we're doing something that you're enjoying so far. And most importantly, perhaps, if you have any questions you'd like us to address or any thoughts that you think that would be useful for us to share, please send them to us. You can send those to lsat@powerscore.com and they will go right to us.
Yes,
so
sir.
Thanks so much. Have a
Thanks,
great
guys.
week.
Bye.